listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
What's up, and welcome to episode 77 of the Straight to Video podcast. I teased online yesterday that this is a special episode, and I'm not lying. It sees my first return guest to the show since we started last summer. And no, I'm not running out of people to get on here because the number 77 has special relevance to this guy, so it only seemed right that we get him back on and have a catch up. Today's guest, all the way from his vacation in South Africa, is Roxie77 himself, Mr. Ryan Roxie. Some of you know him as the guitarist in Alice Cooper's band, some maybe from Electric Angels, or maybe even the second Slash's Snake Pit album. This guy, in his own words and in the name of his own podcast, has been in the trenches for many, many years and still continues to do things at the highest level and always looks cool doing it. A few of you will know that it's no secret that I took the 74 in my own band nickname Laney74 from the Roxie77 idea many years ago, and I owe a heck of a lot to this guy for being someone I've always looked up to in my own journey through the music industry as much as I've been able to be a part of it. So it's a massive deal for me to have him as a guest and a supporter of this show. We talk about a lot of cool stuff from what we spoke about in our first chat back on episode 3 of the show. Episode 3, and now it's 77. Crazy. We talk about Ryan's time in Electric Angels recording their first album. We chat about touring with Danger Danger, CD long boxes, Christina Applegate, and Roxy's very first show with Alice Cooper. I learned a lot in this talk, so I'm sure you all will too. Before we dive in, I'm going to do my regular shout to my friends over at Dead Skull Coffee as we both continue to champion each other. Dead Skull Coffee are an independent rock and roll coffee brand based in South London, making some killer ground or whole bean coffee with real rock star attitude, and it's awesome to have them alongside the Straight to Video podcast. Listeners to this show can grab a 15% discount on your order by adding the code STV on checkout over at deadskullcoffee.co.uk. Or if you're listening to this talk over at stvpod.com, then simply click on their logo in our banner and that will take you right to their site, and the discount will automatically be entered when you check out. It's that easy. After this talk, if you want to find out more about Ryan Roxie, then everything can be found at ryanroxie.com. You can find links to music, videos and merch, along with checking out Ryan's own podcast, In the Trenches. And for all you budding guitarists, please check out Roxie's System 12 guitar method, which is a revolutionary way of learning the guitar. It's all there at ryanroxie.com, and please subscribe to his YouTube channel at Ryan Roxie Official, where there's always cool stuff and exclusive videos happening. So now grab a drink and sit back and enjoy this special episode 77 of the Straight to Video podcast with my guest Ryan Roxie. It's great to see your podcast going from strength to strength. Freaking Rob Alford on there, dude.
Wow. You know what? The guests that we've had on lately, not that like any guest that we have on, I feel very appreciative that they're going to spend the time and tell their stories and inspire us in the trenches and stuff. But yeah, the names seem to be moving up the marquee, so to speak. And it's a good thing. But to be honest with you, I enjoy the stories. It doesn't matter who I have on. And that includes having non-musicians. We've had some very cool intellectuals come on. And by the time you read this, or by the time you air this, or when are you going to air this? 77?
77 is going to be next Tuesday.
Holy smokes. Okay, well, this could be a big bombshell. We will have, I think on our guest, because I'm on a guest on your podcast, a guest on our podcast is an intellectual named Jordan Peterson, which is one of those guys that, you know, you might not know his name in the music world, but if you just turn on the internet, he's like one of the rock stars of the internet. And, you know, a couple of these guys like Eric Weinstein, Jordan Peterson that we've had on, Jamie Kilstein, these are all guys that are not in the music field per se, but all their stories sort of relate and inspire the same way. The ascent of Jordan Peterson, for instance, of becoming a rock star in the internet has been one of those classic tales. You could just, put it into any sort of band story and you could compare the two, very, very similar. And like I said, I love having guitar players on the podcast and anybody that's sort of Alice Cooper alumni. At this point, we've had the original guys on, the original goats, if you will, Michael Bruce and Dennis Dunaway. Perhaps one of these days, Alice is going to have to grace us with an interview.
He's got to, man.
Yeah. What's weird is that I want Alice on all the time, but then I think to myself, you know what? They'd be expecting that.
Okay, yeah.
I want to have Alice Cooper on the podcast when nobody's expecting it. Maybe just go completely unannounced, sort of like, oh, this guy,
Someone's in the waiting room here. Let's get him on.
Let's see what he has to offer. What's been happening lately is that we've had all the current lineup of the touring band. All of them have been on as guests. And a couple weeks back, we did this band meeting online, which was quite cool because Alice showed up. We just did a little recap. If anybody wants to check that out, it's on the Ryan Roxie official YouTube channel. We're still trying to build up that YouTube channel. Rob, I don't know, when you take on any sort of new adventure, I've been sort of dipping my toe into the pool of podcasting since really early on, since like 2005.
Yeah, Rox's Big Rock Show, man. You was early on the game.
Rox's Big Rock Show. And one of my biggest guests back then was the guys in Cheap Trick. Rick Nielsen and Buddy Carlos were my guests. I don't know if you could ever find that episode. I guess I'd have to go through some really, really deep hard drives that are sort of cluttered up in some sort of corner of my closet to find those interviews. But it would be cool to re-air those and just see what it was like. But yeah, I tried it right when podcasting was first sort of being developed. I remember that there was this guy, a lot of people know him as the VJ on MTV, Adam Curry.
Yes.
He was in the States, he was like a VJ.
Didn't he do Ed Banker's Ball before, Ricky Rackman?
He might have done it before Ricky. I'm not sure. He did some sort of rock show. You're right. He always had the Steve West haircut, like the bigger than 80s haircut. But anyway, he's one of the godfathers of podcasting. I think he's known for that. So I started it because I'd read an article about this thing called podcasting. And over the years, I've done so many different versions of it. And about a year and a half ago, I think, summer of 2019, or maybe it was the fall, but right before the pandemic, basically, I started this podcast. And then when the pandemic hit, we really kicked it into gear. And I think the whole point was putting together a team that could do the research, put the production together, and really put together a show. And that's what In the Trenches, at least we're striving for every week, to put on a show, not just an interview with two guys, which is always fun. You got a guest and the host, but also fill it in with some pictures, video clips, maybe have a special guest come on that the guest doesn't know about. I've done that a few times as well. I feel that we've really tried to up the production value of it, and we're still growing, but it's hard to build a friggin' YouTube channel. I mean, we've done pretty well this last year because we have a social media coordinator in Federica. She really does well with
She's relentless, man.
Oh, dude, relentless. I got to tell you, she puts out the ads, she makes up the clips, and, we all sort of contribute to it. Vic Chalfant, our producer, is always coming up with new ways to, I'm trying this animation for this intro. What do you think about that? And I said, it looks great. More animation, more better. The more that catches the eye and keeps people clicked on the, and in tune to the interview, if it helps, Plus the guests and the stories that they bring are just so cool to talk about.
You've always seemed to stay on the pulse of things, particularly when it comes to, let's call it, the Roxy brand.
You think? I mean,
well, it is. You've always done that. Even back when I became a fan, you had the cool website with you had to choose the pill. Which one are you going to choose to enter?
The red pill or the blue pill? That was a cool idea. I mean, that was, Andy came up with that. I sometimes I come up with these ideas and I don't know if they're possible, and they're usually nods to 70s television, if I must be honest. Like, so many of my nods come from the original Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory 70s movie with
Right.
Gene Wilder. I love that and that era. But in 70s sort of television shows, if you will, there's a show called Love American Style that used to be on. And we blatantly, for one of the ideas that I had, we blatantly just ripped it off and called it Club American Style. So, yeah, I mean, look, just like music and just like maybe your own personal journey as a musician, you have huge inspirations and you borrow from each one and try and make it your own. And I appreciate you saying that I've had my finger on the pulse. I mean, at the same time, true to what the title of the podcast is, I've sort of been in the trenches, because my ego ain't so big that I feel that I'm bigger than I am. I feel that people are still starting to discover, like, who is this guy, Ryan Roxie? I like his show. And I don't mind that at all, because I want to be the guy that gets discovered after 40 years of doing it, because I have been in the trenches. I have been doing this, since I was a little kid. It's what I wanted to do, whether it's performance in some way, whether it's music, and, now doing music as well as the podcast. I'm under no false impressions that I realize whose coattails I get to ride and who opens the doors, the names playing with guys like Alice Cooper that have helped me out.
Alice has always been cool about that, just giving a spotlight to everybody.
That's the best part of playing with Alice Cooper, is that he is so secure.
Encourages it.
Yeah, he's so secure with his own legacy, his own fame, his own persona, that he wants to give others the spotlight. Give him, like, hey, when you have a guitar solo, I don't want you in the corner of the stage. I want you front and center with all the spotlights on you, but just make sure you step off that when I go back to do my third verse.
Speaking of like coming up with cool ideas, back in the days of Hollywood, did you do any cool things to help promote the band back then? Or was it just usually the Kenko flyers and all that?
Yeah, obviously the Kinko flyers and basically contributing to the carbon imprint of, I think, rock bands, I think, are going to probably be held accountable for global warming at the very end of the day from all the little flyers that we passed out on the Sunset Strip. It'll come back to haunt us. But what other ideas that we did? I was one of the first sort of bands to have a hotline, like a telephone number that you could call in and just say whatever you wanted to say, leave a message. And I believe it was 7077 DPM. If I'm not mistaken, don't look for that number anymore. But what it would do is people would call that number up and the message light would go off on a beeper. This is a funny thing. We're the first band with a beeper, mostly reserved for drug dealers and, lawyers, I think, back in those days. But we had a beeper. And the reason why this story is relevant is because on the first Dad's Porno Mag record, in reality, the only Dad's Porno Mag record that was put out is Dad's Porno Mag. It just got released under a few different names and a few different looks. But Dad's Porno Mag has a bonus track on it. If you're lucky enough to find the track 77, because that was back in the day when we released a CD, and at the end of track 12, there's like about maybe 30, 35 minutes of just dead air, but it keeps rolling.
There's a few albums like that where you listen to it and you fall asleep, then all of a sudden you're scared shitless about half an hour later when it comes back. Well,
Rob, if you were following us from the original DPM days, then you must have heard My Bad Knee.
Yeah.
And you must have heard track 77. And I think we actually have it now. It's just listed as track 77. But there is a little intro there. And all those little intros are from that hotline that we had. And you can hear there's some weird like messages that we get from time to time. But if you actually listen to the dial tones, the doot, 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 if you're really good at deciphering what those numbers are, you can find out the exact number of what we were dialing, because that's
amazing.
What we did.
As this is episode 77, I think we should bring up for listeners where the name Roxie 77 came from. Now, I always seem to remember you chose that number because of what a cool year that was for music, movies, and just the whole time. Have I got that totally clouded over the years?
It eventually became that. Yeah, it sort of started as an enigma that's become a riddle that's shrouded in mystery, I think. And the story kind of evolves.
Just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, it evolves and it has twists and turns. But Okay, here's as much as I can recall those days, because, I came up with the name Roxy 77 in the early 90s. So the early 90s for me were a bit fuzzy as well, just like the year probably 77 was for the most of the world. But it is a really great year for music. And you have to Google music albums 1977 just to see how many amazing great records came out in that year, either a debut album or one of a band's strongest album that they've had. So quite frankly, most of those albums and bands became influential in what I sort of been trying to do ever since.
It's my 1990 or 1991, that is.
Yes. But the real reason why I started signing at 77, my name, because there were some very early on, I'd sign it Ryan Roxie 77. And the reason why was because in the early 90s, I was playing with Gilby Clarke. And he was from Guns N' Roses, and he was doing his solo album, his first solo album called Pawn Shop Guitars. And we ended up touring that, and I ended up playing with Gilby. I had played with him before for years in a band called Candy, but we also played together on this Pawn Shop Guitars tour, and then a bunch of subsequent tours after that. So Gilby and I are pretty tight, right? But back in I think it was 1992 or 93, when this all first began, when we would go into any sort of live setting, any sort of signing party for this album, he would sign it Gilby Clarke 92 or 93, it would be Gilby Clarke GNR 92. And so at that point, there was no bigger band on the planet, no bigger name that you could write than GNR 92 or GNR 91, GNR 93. So he was in the biggest band on the planet that year. And I was like, there's no way that I could even come close to competing with that. So why I can sort of have a little bit of competitiveness because I can age the autograph. So I can say it came from 1977.
Right.
So I would just write Ryan Roxie 77. So people would go years later, like maybe like today, they look at it and they go, oh man, they got this from the 70s. That's cool. That's vintage. I'd have a vintage autograph. So partly was a little bit of a joke. Partly was probably a little bit of ego. Like, hey, I want to have an important autograph too. So what ended up happening is the more research that came out of 77, then all these albums start popping up. Oh my God, it's the first two Cheap Trick records. It's the Sex Pistols debut album. It's Queen, News of the World, Fleetwood Mac, Rumors, Eagles, Hotel California. There's so many records that came out in 1970. The Clash had a huge album in 77. So, I mean, I think it was their first album as well. So many great, or maybe it was London Calling. What was a Clash London Calling? I'll bet you it's 77. Do your research. We'll see. So anyway, it sort of evolved. The 77, the significance of 1977 evolved after I started signing it. But to be honest with you, I just wanted a vintage looking autograph to compete with Gilby's GNR 92 or whatever it was.
The guys from Bowling for Soup, they always signed theirs. They had numbers after their names. Like I think it was 51, 52, 53, and 54. And they've never disclosed why they do it.
Damn.
It's kept within that circle of band.
I like the fact that there's a little bit of mystery left to that. I mean, because, I do have some inside sort of Easter eggs that maybe people should find out about within the trenches, and I'll keep it a mystery. But I like letting, some breadcrumbs, give people some sort of clues to what it is and let them speculate. Because for years and years, I didn't say anything about the 77. I was just like, how did it come about? And I was like, well, you got to just go on the research and do the research. It's all there on that World Wide Web. But now I realize that now there's so much crap on the World Wide Web that you start by searching for Ryan Roxie 1977, and then you end up down some sort of things with, rabbits on crutches. Usually having sex with some sort of other hamster. I'm not sure. It's weird.
We kind of left off the last chat talking about Electric Angels getting signed at a show in New York by Atlantic Records. It was that show with Dogs D'Amore and Mother Love Bone. That insane lineup. That's just crazy.
Mother Love Bone that became Pearl Jam eventually. And then it was Dogs D'Amore right when they were really hitting it as far as popularity. And it was one of those shows that was a very magical show for us. It ended up being a very magical show for Electric Angels because we actually got the record deal and were able to really sort of, survive off of that for my whole time living in New York City. Back in those days, a record deal, you'd get in advance. I know that record companies these days are like, an advance? What is an advance? Any musicians out there are going, what? You mean people will give you money before you make a record these days? Yeah, they actually gave you a pretty good amount of money in hopes that you would be successful. They would assume that your album would sell enough that they'd make all their money back plus a huge percentage, and you would at least be able to survive. So we were able to survive off the advances, publishing advance. And so that one show funded us for a good number of years until I moved out of New York and back to Los Angeles.
Didn't you record the album in London, or was it part of the album in London? Because I know you had a trip over there.
That's true. What happened was we were trying to find the right producer for our band. We were kind of like a square peg trying to fit in a round hole, and the round hole was like hair metal. We were lumped in with a lot of cool bands, but they were regarded as hair metal bands. Like we would tour and we would open up and do shows for bands that might not be our exact perfect fit. Like Dogs D'Amour, I felt, was one of the perfect fit that we toured with. And then once our album came out, we got to do tours with bands like London Choir Boys. And those were a much better fit for Electric Angels.
Just that kind of low-strung guitar, that swagger.
Yeah, a little bit more, lack of a better term, a UK-based type of rock and roll, even though we were formed in Los Angeles. We definitely had New York Dolls influences. We definitely had Hanoi Rocks influences. And, if you listen to the songs, our bassist, Jonathan Daniel, he was really influenced lyrically by guys like Elvis Costello.
It's very pop.
There's a pop underline.
Pop when I'm talking like the Cars kind of.
The Cars was a great example of a band. And you know what? Even because we were all from California, some of the Bay Area, more pop stuff as well. I mean, it sounds weird, but when I mention names like Eddie Money, he was like a straight up rock and roll, but then you have pop overtones with it as well.
Would you throw Rick Springfield in there, sir?
I would definitely throw Rick Springfield in there. He's one of my favorite guys. I would love for him, actually get him on the podcast one of these days, and it was one of those serendipitous moments when he just happened to start playing one of my guitars that I had a signature model, a GMP Roxie model, and he ended up playing that for many years. So it was quite cool. Two of my sort of influence guys, Rick Springfield and Neil Giraldo, who plays guitar for Pat Benatar. Both of them played my signature guitar, and I'd love to have both of those guys on the podcast, to be honest with you. But Pat Benatar is another great example of a pop driven but rock band as well. So getting back to the producer, we were trying to look for that perfect producer, and the name Tony Visconti just kept coming up because we're like, look at these records, Bowie, especially T-Rex, all this Mark Bolan stuff. Let's see if he's available. Let's take a shot at it and see if he's actually available. And he was. And we were living in New York, and he had ties to New York because he's from there, the East Coast, but he had been living in the UK for the longest time. And he was married to May Pang, who, if you guys know about May Pang, she was in that whole John Lennon, Yoko Ono, The Lost Weekend, all that sort of whole days and scenes of that. So there was obviously some rich history that was involved. Rock and roll pedigree was involved in this pairing. And just so happened that we were one of the last bands to record out of his studio, because Tony had a studio called Good Earth Studios. It was in Soho, London, not Soho, New York. It was Soho, London. And it was right kind of borderline on Chinatown, I believe. And we were able to go there, live in Shepherd's Bush. We actually stayed at the studios. I believe it was the Virgin Studios in Shepherd's Bush, but we didn't record there. We just stayed at the facilities because they had like apartments. And then we'd take the train into Soho every day to record. That was really, even though the whole process only took about 6 weeks, it was the best month and a half, I feel, of my musical sort of education, because you learn so much being in the studio with someone like Tony Visconti. All his studio tricks that he used for recording Mark Bolan, all his composing experience. He did the strings for Paul McCartney's Band on the Run. He arranged it and composed it. And so it was a real trip to be able to walk in a couple days in the studio and see a full-on string section, doubling your guitar parts and your guitar sections and parts that you sort of came up with writing, in a rehearsal room, and then all of a sudden it translates to this vinyl and album and these things called CDs that were just new at the time. You're like one of the last bands to have an album released on vinyl and then only CD. So we were like one of those last bands that had our debut album released on cassette tape, CD, and vinyl album. So that was quite cool.
Did you have the CD long box?
Oh, we had the CD long box. Yes, we did. I'm sure there's a lot of those. I don't know if anybody actually held on to those, but there's got to be one or two. But yeah, I mean,
those things go for big money online, just for any band.
Really? Okay, there's have to be someone that has them, because I've seen a lot of promotional distribution copies, they call it, with the little cutout. I'm not sure if they printed up more distribution copies of Electric Angels than actual albums, but I've seen a shitload of those cutout ones. And I'm sure the long box. Yeah, it's funny that you bring up the long box. It was definitely a thing.
Was Atlantic Records supportive of like your choices for producer and like, oh, we're just going to go to London?
They were, and they let us do what we wanted to do, and they let us make the album we wanted to make. Now, once we made the album and it was finished and it was done, because we were based in New York, we were sort of always in their ear. And I don't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, because if we're always in their ear and saying, hey, can we do this? Can we do this? I'm not sure if we annoyed them or if we were just taken for granted, like, oh, they're sort of our guys. Because we were always going into the Atlantic offices, and striking up a relationship with the promotion people and trying to get them to do as much as they could. Problem was, with Atlantic Records back in those days, that philosophy that they had, they would release a lot of records every week. And at the end of whatever, a couple weeks of promo and putting it out there, whichever one sort of stuck to the wall, that's the one that would get the most attention. That's the one that would get all of a sudden the bigger promo bucks. So I think the fact that we sold as many records as we did by just being, again, in the trenches, touring constantly, up and down, basically, if there was a gig offered, we'd say yes. It didn't matter where we drive to it. If it was a good opening slot or if it was a good opening tour, let's make it happen one way or another. So I think we did a lot of that self-promotion, and it's taught me to do it years later on our own. But at the same time, I do give credit to Atlantic for letting us make the record we wanted to make and letting us use the producer we wanted to use. And for us coming out with a record that, even though it's in the genre of hair metal, it does stand on its own all these years later, and it's on its little island, if you will. And I feel that, you could always look back to it and go, well, why didn't they just promote it? We had Christina Applegate in our video at the time.
That's amazing.
That was Rattlesnake Kisses. We didn't take advantage of that. We didn't use that opportunity to its full extent, because if you look at it, even today, if you go online, you say, is that Christina Applegate from Married with Children and subsequent all these amazing movies? But, at that time, Married with Children, the television show, was, again, a huge show. And she had always been really cool with the band. But the way that we sort of masked her behind diaphanous shots, and it was kind of behind sheets, it was like, I think that who's ever in the video, that video chick looks like Christina Applegate. Whereas we should have just said, dude, we are milking this for what it's worth, because then maybe Atlantic Records would have said, oh, okay, we get it. Yeah, they're going to be, that band. And like I said, at the end of the day, the people that know about Electric Angels really like it, and to this day support it. And you're one of them. And I thank you for that.
There's a lovely quote from your old drummer, John Schubert, on your show. He says, you all left New York in leather and came back in velvet.
Oh, that is really true. Like, we give credit to Camden Market. We give credit to, what was the other place called?
Is it Carnaby Street or something like that?
Yeah, Carnaby. It was also, there was a place that started with the T. It was a big building that had multi-levels. I know it was just Tottenham Court Road, but there's a lot of, during that time, velvet wasn't popular at that point in the States. So we had about a 6-month. And it wasn't like there was an internet that people could just post up and say, well, this is what I'm wearing here. Oh, that looks cool. No, it took time to migrate over to the States.
You were seeing that in magazines, which were showing photographs, which were taken 2 months before.
Months before. Yes. So we had a little bit of a head start on the American bands, and we ran with that. And we just liked it. I think for about 2 years, all I wore was this black velvet top hat. I mean, Slash obviously had his top hat back in those days, but mine was a little bit more Alice in Wonderland or a little bit more Jellyfish, if you will, and we came out, before Jellyfish, but Jellyfish took it even another step further and went a little bit more psychedelic. We kind of kept it back in, I guess the best way to describe it, we always tried to mimic what the Exile on Main Street, Rolling Stones era, I guess that sort of vibe where it was kind of, what would you call it? Heroin chic.
Yeah.
Does that sound good?
It's like that old gutter rock kind of thing, but not even gutter rocks, because you guys look good in all the Velvet. Not Adam and the Ants kind of stuff, because that was a little bit more left field.
That was a little bit more Sgt. Pepper's meets, it sort of goes in that direction. But thank you for saying that we look good in it. We didn't smell so good in it because you have to dry clean all that stuff. And back in those days, priorities were priorities. And it was like, well, do we want a slice of pizza and, a beer, or do we want to dry clean our Velvet? Yeah. And it was man. I think the pizza and beer always sort of prevailed, except for our singer. Our singer was very into, clean clothes and always looking, one of his influences, Michael Monroe. So it was, to look up at Michael Monroe at that time, Michael was always dressed to the nines. And so Shane was sort of like a brunette version of that. Mm-hmm. He was his own guy and his own voice, obviously, and his own frontman. But you could easily see us on the same bill with Michael Monroe and go, oh, they're Salt and Pepper Shakers.
You guys went out with Danger Danger. Did you both know each other before then?
We met years before. We've known each other for years, at least Steve and Bruno. That's Steve West and Bruno Ravel. But Steve was a big Cheap Trick fan ever since day one. So Steve West and I always hit it off with that sort of, and Rick Springfield, to be honest with you. Steve West and I always hit things off in that sort of pop rock sensibility. And we would just hang, and we would go out to the clubs and we'd mostly just chill and hang because he had a car. That was kind of cool. He lived out on Long Island, and he would bring his car into Queens because when we first moved to Queens, we lived right over I think it's the 57th Street Bridge in a place called Long Island City. The whole band, Electric Angels, lived together in this one small little house. And because he had a car, it would be much, again, cheaper. For us, we were very, wait for Steve to pick us up than to have a subway token, which is kind of silly in that time because I think a subway token back in those days was like $1, something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, he'd pick us up. We'd go into the city. We'd hang out. And then he made this record, Danger, Danger, and put it out, and it just took off. And he had, Danger, Danger, Naughty, Naughty, Bang, Bang. Everything was double the love, double the fun.
I wonder if that was just by coincidence and they didn't realize it until, got another one like that. I have no idea.
I don't know. Definitely seemed to be some things about Danger, Danger that they were early on. You can't say it was a boy band. It was definitely planned, the type of music that they had. They knew those big choruses. When they wrote a big chorus to a song, and we would see it being the opening band on the tour, where when they started a certain song, everyone knew that chorus was coming, and they would go nuts, and they knew how to milk it. They knew how to choreography. Steve with his blonde-haired Tommy Lee moves that he would do with on the drums, and people just loved him. But then, Steve would make it his own by wearing this ridiculous baseball cap with the bill, which he still does, I think. If I'm not mistaken, Steve is still a big fan of the baseball cap, which I give him credit because he has a beautiful head of hair, and he should flaunt it all the time. But like for me, for years, I've been wearing a hat, but now my hat, I don't wear out of image. I wear it out of necessity.
Superb. There was a second Electric Angel album, which finally saw the light of day a few years ago. How far down the line had that gone with the record label?
So what happened was we had toured with the original Electric Angels album, and then we wanted to go in and start immediately make a second record. The best way to do that was record demos and sort of make the demos as good as we could so we could show the label, hey, we're ready to go for a second record. Let's do this. Because obviously the numbers, even though I felt the numbers of what we sold was respectable, and in today's world, it would actually be more than respectable. It would be a hit. That's the funny thing. The amount of records that we sold back in those days was so much more than what you'd think about today because of streaming and all that stuff. So we needed to make some demos, and Tony Visconti's son was available, and he had been practicing to doing engineering, and he'd sort of worked out a home recording studio that they had in New York. And because by this time May Pang and Tony Visconti had moved back to New York City. So Tony Visconti's son actually produced these songs for us. We call them the Tupperware sessions because the actual drums on some of those songs were triggers that were mounted onto Tupperware. So the Hawk, instead of playing his signature sparkle, what was it, a Ludwig kit that he had, or that big silver sparkle kit that he had, instead of playing that, he was playing these little Tupperware pans that were triggering these, at this time we felt, amazing drum sounds because it was just technology. It was the first time that all of a sudden everything was analog with the first Electric Angels album. 2-inch tape, everything was done on. It took a while to record because of the rewind button. Just getting the magnetic tape, it was that old school mentality. Now, all of a sudden, this was our first taste of digital recording. And Tony's son was just really great at it. So we did about half dozen songs with him. And then we said, we like these and we're going to write a few more and let's try and produce it ourselves. But this time we'll use a little bit more real instruments and we'll go into a proper studio. And so we did another little batch of songs there. And we had about an album's worth of material. And that's when we went to Atlantic and said, listen to these demos. And these are just the demos. Wait till you hear the album. This is going to be the next, this is going to be Electric Angels 2.0. It's going to be hit the road again. Let's go. And then it was like, we were met with like, well, let's see. And whenever a label starts telling you, do you have any more? That's when the red flags go up, because it's always like, do you have any more? Basically means we don't believe in what you have. You have to write more songs. And we did. So we immediately started to see what else was out there. And I remember this like it was yesterday. A lawyer we sat down with at a label said, because at that point we were like, well, you know what? Screw it. We're going to go look for our own label. We want to be on our own. If they're not going to support these demos, they're not going to support whatever we make. We really feel this is strong enough material. So we want off the label. And I remember sitting down with the lawyer and he just goes, just remember, guys, I can get you off this label, but it's much better to be on a label than not be on a label. And we were like, yeah, but you know what? We have to be off this label in order to get onto another label. So get us off. And we were kind of like a little bit maybe naive and maybe a little bit too self-assured that we would just fall into another record deal. And so we got off the Atlantic and expecting open arms from everybody. And at that point, it was like, no, there wasn't open arms. And it was like a little bit of a life lesson, and now looking back thinking, wow, it is always better to be on a label than not be on a label.
What year was that then?
This would have had been 90, maybe 91, late 90, 91. The whole releasing of the album, 89 to 90 touring, and then subsequently moving back from New York to Los Angeles, that happened around 92. So this is, around 91, 90, or maybe early 92, all this stuff was going down. And unfortunately, no one ended up picking up that album. That's why it's called Lost in the Atlantic. There's a little nod there to Atlantic Records, because we did feel like we were a little bit lost at that label at the very end, and we were lost in the Atlantic. And I'm glad it finally did see the light of day. And like I said, some of those songs I think you hear on that album are those original Tupperware demos, and you hear some other cool tracks that are on it as well.
Was you seeing like a shift in the music landscape around that time? Was the band noticing anything?
Oh, dude. I mean, I definitely noticed.
Yeah.
The minute Nevermind came out, I noticed big time, because I just felt like this is the type of album that I would want to hear if it was the first time I was listening to rock and roll. If this was my first experience, my first taste of heavy guitar driven, music, this is what I want. I think Nirvana was the first people to admit that they basically made Cheap Trick in color and Cheap Trick debut album, Cheap Trick. They made it with heavier guitars. those pop overtones were definitely there. It's just that they just, triple tracked it and quadruple tracked it, and then had this voice of Kurt Cobain that was just screeching, but still melodic. I mean, like I said, that album, once I heard that album, I knew that there was going to be a paradigm shift in the way that the music was going to go. And it eventually did, because all of a sudden you could see that there was a new scene, and our sort of scene that we had been in, which was lucky enough to be part of that Los Angeles hair metal scene and that New York sort of rock and roll bar scene, was shifting. And you could see more bands that had those influences and more of those actual bands coming to the clubs that we were playing. I remember going to see Soundgarden at the Cat Club in New York City, which is on 13th Street or 14th Street back in those days. No, it's 13th Street. Don Hill owned it, and Don Hill was a major club guy of New York, and he owned the Cat Club and then eventually owned Don Hill's. But he was a real supporter. He always supported good rock and roll music. He saw the change as well. And all of a sudden, more of those types of bands were coming out. And by that time, I had made the decision to go back to Los Angeles, and sort of, I've never been a musical whore, at least with playing with the guys that I play with, Electric Angels. I always stuck to one band. I played in Electric Angels. I played in Candy. I stuck it out with the guys in Candy. The guys in Candy eventually morphed itself into Electric Angels. I stayed with that band. And by the time I moved back to New York, I said, you know what? I'm going to start playing with any band I can just to get the experience. So I formed my own band called The Unbelievable Truth, which eventually became Dad's Porno Mag, and as well as started putting out feelers to play with whoever I could. And one of the guys that came back to me was an old bandmate of mine, Gilby Clarke. And that's how the whole Gilby Clarke playing with him solo came in. And then all of a sudden from there, those doors opened up, and I played for a while in a band from Seattle called Sweetwater, which is a very cool band, very cool rock and roll band. Sweetwater is one of those albums, it's called Super Friends, that has that perfect blend of sort of grunge rock, tiny bit, but more straight ahead rock. And it was from Seattle.
Is that readily available, or is it pretty tough to track down?
That might be one of those ones you might have to go down a little bit of a rabbit hole to find, but it was, we were managed by the same management company that was managed by Soundgarden, Susan Silver Management at the time. The band had a really good following up in Seattle. So yeah, check it out, because there is a Sweetwater that's like more of a 1970s classic rock band. And that
always seems to be the case when you search for something. It always pulls up like some tribute band or some kind of covers band.
If you want to Google it right, go Super Friends, Sweetwater, Seattle. Just remember the 3 S's. I think you'll really like that album. I think you'll really like that album, Rob. It's right up your alley.
You eventually landed the gig with Alice in 1996, and I've always been intrigued to know who came up with what I think is a crazy idea for your first show to be done in a small club with a bunch of special guests, and let's record it for a live album as well.
Yeah, I mean,
who came up with that idea?
I don't know, some sort of sadist to say, okay, here's your big break, Roxy, but there's only one little caveat. Actually, a couple caveats involved. It's your big break if you're good at it, if you nail it, but everything has to go right. It was sort of like taking that shot at, the Star Wars guys would have to take to blow up the Death Star. You need to have the perfect shot that would hit that. I got the audition, and luckily all those stars aligned. So I got the plane ticket down to Mexico, and it was a club called Cabo Wabo, which is owned by Sammy Hagar and the guys in Van Halen. And so we have the club. That's going to be our rehearsal spot to get all these songs together, which is about 40 songs whittled down to 20 song set. So I had to learn 40 songs to begin with in the weeks coming up to that show. My brain was just spinning of just songs. It was just Alice Cooper 101, go to sleep listening to Alice Cooper songs, wake up playing Alice Cooper songs nonstop.
Was you liaising with Reb at the time? Because he was doing the other guitar stuff. So was there any chance to...
That's the thing. Again, it was kind of right in the infancy of the internet. So it wasn't like we could do anything online. It was maybe an email at best from an AOL address, to be honest. So what we would do is we just learned what we felt was our strength and kind of relying on the other person's strength, because I knew that Reb is such an accomplished musician. He's going to do a lot of the shredding stuff. Let him take care of all those 80s stuff, kind of like the same mentality that we have today. Let me take care of that classic rock 70s stuff. And, I'll definitely hold my own with all the stuff up to date. But, when it comes to niche stuff and nuanced stuff, if there's a classic rock solo from one of the guys in the original band, let me have that solo. And then obviously if there's something that Kane Roberts is going to play, let Reb do it, or let Nita do it. Let these amazing shredder guitar players shred on that stuff, because that's sort of their strength as well. So play to everybody's strength. So we get down there. It's our little rehearsal studio. But then they start moving in all this recording equipment. And it wasn't like I didn't know it was going to be recorded, but then all of a sudden it makes it real. So they start recording and building a set. And all of a sudden, a day or two before the show, these guests start arriving, because I didn't know about all the guests that were going to start arriving. So first Rob Zombie comes. He's like, "Hey, great to meet you." It's the first time I ever met Rob. And turns out he's going to come up and play a song. Oh, that's cool. That's great. And then Slash, gets down and
just throw another guitar player in there.
And that was the thing. I was like, okay, well, what song are we going to do? He goes, well, let's do I learned a couple of them because I played on Lost in America. That's cool. But I also learned Only Women Bleed. Alice, you have to understand, is at the rehearsals, but he's not on stage. He's sort of directing it with one of the managers and just seeing how things are working out, because he wants to see what it looks like from an audience perspective before he gets on stage and just performs it, because then he'll know what the audience is seeing. So Alice thinks it's a great idea. We do Only Women Bleed with Slash. The only problem is the version that we had learned of Only Women Bleed was the live version, sort of condensed version. And of course, Slash had learned the album version. He had learned the, long Bob Ezrin ballet piano classic, which just sounds amazing when you can nail those parts on guitar. And he had done that. So whose version do you think we had to learn? It wasn't going to be, it wasn't going to be Slash adapting to us. We adapted to our special guest. So we learned a whole new version right before that. And then more guys started showing up. Sammy Hagar was hanging out and he said, yeah, I would love to come up and sing one. So, all these things are not only, they're going to come up and perform in front of an audience, it's going to be recorded and filmed for VH1. So to say that, the pressure wasn't on was ridiculous. And if I can remember correctly, at first they'd said, sorry guys, we don't have time because of the scheduling. There's no room for overdubs. So you kind of have to nail it. And we were like, are you kidding me?
Oh, no way.
Luckily, there was a couple things that they had to technically snafu'd a little bit. I think one of the recorders went out for a couple seconds here and there on one of the, overheads, which meant we had that window to fix up anything that was messed up. But to be honest with you, I think for that Fistful of Alice, which eventually became that album, there was only one or two overdubs that I ended up doing, because everything is live from that night, from the very first time I've ever played with Alice on stage. And that was, by the way, the first time that I'd ever played on stage with him, because at the audition, he watched on the couch. He saw us play the songs on the couch, and he was sitting there again, observing what it's going to look like from an audience perspective.
What was the band which you auditioned with? Who was in that band?
The band that I auditioned with was Bob Daisley on bass, who's an amazing bass player, and Eric Singer on drums.
Okay.
It was basically a trio, which was quite cool to do, because then Alice could really hear what my raw guitar parts were. And of course, he had Bob Daisley and Eric Singer as a rhythm section, and you can totally rely on those guys to be, rock solid. So that audition to this day, was one of my most proudest moments as a musician, because I went in there saying, I'm going to get this gig. And I walked out of there sort of not knowing, but feeling really strongly that I got the gig, So it was like one of those, what do you call it? A perfect golf shot, a perfect gig. It was one of the best auditions I've ever been on. Thankful to this day that it all worked out.
If you hadn't have got the gig, you'd have been happy with what you brought. I did my friggin' best.
Yeah, I would have been completely happy with what happened. But again, to go back to that Electric Angels show with Dogs D'Amour, where we got a record deal, that one show helped us out for, a couple years and getting the record deal and all that stuff, and basically paid for everything. That one audition I did in 96 with Alice has helped me to this day sort of have an income and have a sort of life as a musician. So you always got to be, you can't make it a big deal in the moment. You can't go, oh my God, this could be life changing forever and ever. But you have to have a little bit of understanding to yourself that, you know what, if I nail this, which I feel very confident because I put the work into it and I should, then this could actually help me for many, many more years. And that's what that audition sort of proved to do.
What's next for you other than Alice? There's got to be something bubbling under. Got to be.
I think right now, everybody is so starved for live entertainment that it's going to be a really good run, knock on wood. It's going to be a very cool time to go watch bands play because the bands are not only going to be rejuvenated and excited, the audiences are too. It's not like this is the first time that I can ever remember, and definitely the first time since 96, since that first tour with Alice, that he didn't play Europe and that he didn't play the United States. He took a year off. It wasn't by design, but he took a year off. So that means all these people is going to be double the anticipation, because even when we come every year, even when we come to, to a lot of these places that we play, a lot of our staples and mainstays that we are able to play while going on tour with Alice, even if it's just been a year, people are super excited to see it. So imagine, having that extra year off. So there's going to be a certain palpable feeling of just pure release when we start going out and touring again. So I'm focused on that. But at the same time, I'm also focused on building up the podcast and the guitar system that I've developed with the guys over at System 12, because if anyone's interested in learning how to play guitar, I have a system called the System 12 Guitar Method, and it teaches you within 12 lessons. And the idea is to do 12 lessons, one a week, so you can learn a basic fundamental education of guitar in 12 weeks. You can get all the fundamentals and sort of foundation that you need for playing guitar within 12 weeks if you apply yourself. And I really think it's one of the best courses out there. So I'm going to, continue to grow that System 12 Guitar Method as well as the podcast. And trust me, as soon as we get out there on the road, I'm going to be ready to play.
Well, congratulations on the podcast. Thank you for giving me a kick up the arse with it. I'm like, what's he going to do next? What's he going to do next?
Congratulations to you, man. You've done way more episodes than me in a much shorter time because you're a maniac.
I bit off more than I could chew, I think.
No, but I like it. All the names that I see on the roster are always interesting. I'm like, oh, yeah, I'd like to hear what he has to say.
Appreciate that, mate. Well, thanks for checking back in and being my first return guest on this show.
It's been a pleasure being on episode 77, and I really appreciate you reserving that number for me, because it is an important number for me.
Awesome, man. You enjoy the rest of your trip. I look forward to seeing you again soon, but it's been great to speak to you again.
Thanks, buddy. Thanks for having me on episode 77. Enjoy it.
We did it.
Yeah. Have a great one, Rob. I'll talk to you soon, bud. See you, man.
Cheers to the legend that is Ryan Roxie for joining me here on episode 77 of the Straight to Video podcast. That really was a lot of fun, and I appreciate Ryan's support and kind words for this show. Don't forget to fill your boots with everything in the Roxie world, from his podcast In the Trenches, the System 12 Guitar Method, and also some of the finest power pop and pop rock tunes you're ever likely to hear. It's all over at ryanroxie.com and also on his YouTube channel at Ryan Roxie Official. Thanks to all of you, as always, for supporting, sharing and championing this show too. Your kind words and feedback make it all worthwhile, and I look forward to sharing a lot more fun chats over the coming weeks, which I've already got recorded and in the bag. Keep up to date at stvpod.com, where all episodes can be found. But until next time, thanks for listening, guys. Please take care, and I'll speak to you all again soon.